Sam ended up announcing this internal code red push on December 2nd and had an emergency level company-wide refocus on ChatGPT.
Frankly, I don't really care whether a model has like a score of 83.8 on MMLU and this sort of like, oh, we have to really compete for 0.1% increase in performance. I think that's losing the plot.
Speaking patterns break the code, pre-trained pod.
And welcome back to the Pre-Trained Pod, where AI scientists talk shop and talk shit. Welcome back, everybody. First episode of 2026.
2026, baby. Here we go.
I'm Pierce Freeman, AI founder based in San Francisco, and I've built and sold multiple AI startups.
Yo soy Richard Deal Martinez. I am an AI research fellow at the University of Cambridge.
Richard, hola.
Hola, buenos dias. How are
Feliz-
you, sir?
Feliz
Good to
Navidad.
see you, dude. It's been a while.
Yeah, seriously, it's been way
3
too long.
weeks. 3 weeks, right? Something like that.
Yeah. We have a lot of cached content for one another, considering that we just talked for 4 hours off mic.
We did not talk at AI at all, so we still got at least another 2 hours in us, dude.
That's exactly right. We talked the stuff that none of our listeners care about. So we'll spare you those details, although maybe we'll throw some of them in the bonus credits after the podcast. Richard, we have a good show. It was a little sleepy over the holidays. I feel like not a ton of AI news, but enough stuff to talk about coming into the new year that I feel like will make for a pretty good recap of what happened in late December. So in this episode, I'm thinking that we can cover AI models in news delivery, OpenAI's code red over Gemini 3, reliability of chain of thought for interpretability research, and then an overview on Claude Skills. All right, so even if it's been a slow season for AI, it's been a roaring start to 2026 in geopolitics. It's not a geopolitics show, but in case you haven't checked the news, the US launched a military attack on Venezuela and extracted their president slash soft pseudo dictator, Nicolas Maduro, and then flew him back to New York to face charges on drug trafficking. Arguably one of the biggest pieces of news in the world right now, but chatbots wouldn't really know about it, right? Because it's not baked in to the weights of any of these models. Wired did some research in the aftermath of this military effort and found that of all of the major chatbots, Gemini and Claude were able to successfully research online, find contemporary news via an open internet tool call, and then gave back the correct news, even if it denied it initially. ChatGPT, on the other hand, just flagrantly denied it and got pretty aggressive, gaslighting the reporter by saying, this is all fake news.
Yeah, the
That actually
gaslighting is
happened."
always first class. Yeah.
Totally. It's like sycophantic gaslighting. So, Rich, I wonder what your take was here. It feels like maybe this is a lot of hoopla for nothing. I don't know how many people actually use these LLMs for news gathering and for distillation, but I imagine as they become more popular or become an alternative or a supplement to people Google searching things, the necessity to have updated information is like a pretty first-class primitive of these systems.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, did you mention that these were the free models? Because I think that is important to caveat as well. Because what's going on here is that if you look at the free models, these models will try to save money in whatever ways they can. So if you're on the freemium version, basically what happens is that they'll try to give you a good premium experience, but without having to spend the big bucks. Because obviously you're not paying them, right? So they're not really incentivized to spin up a bunch of compute to service your request. So I think what's going on here, frankly, is you shouldn't read too much into it. I think they're trying to get these models to not query the internet because that's expensive. This sort of prompt sounds a little conspiracy theory-esque, right? On its surface, like it's kind of hard to believe that this actually happened. And so I could imagine that these cheap models that don't actually want to search the internet, when they receive a prompt like this, that, in their internal systems, they've probably learned to flag as bogus or a hoax, they won't go the extra miles to search it, right? And I think it's interesting that if you then actually do the same analysis and you try it with the premium models, they will actually often search the internet. I think ChatGPT in this case, the premium version actually did search the internet. We tried this just before the show. So I wouldn't read too much into it. I don't think it's that surprising, frankly. I think this sort of surprised everyone, including ChatGPT, frankly. And that's what we're seeing here. I mean, it just seems so implausible that if you look at the training data that these models were trained on, right? In the space of factually plausible things, this is probably one of those items that is very likely to not have happened or to be very unlikely to have occurred. And that's just what the models are picking up on. I think that's pretty much it, man. I don't know. What do you think?
I think that there's some tension here that's just built in with LLMs as a whole, right? Where it has some knowledge that is baked into the weights, which is useful in and of itself, right? Like the model having captured some sense of history, having read a textbook or like doing whatever, knowing in some latent space, like this is how the geopolitical situation works, is useful because it means that it's not grounding every single reasoning step and having to do a web search and come back, which is only ever going to give you basically the content of that web search as something that it can work on to do reasoning. The fact that we have trained these things to have this deeper notion, I think is actually what gives LLMs a lot of their power, or at least their generalizability. Same kind of thing, right? That like Google searching some programming question is probably not going to deliver you the exact coding snippet that you're looking for. But because LLMs actually have some deeper knowledge of how coding works, it's able to deliver you some customized thing. You think that that's a good emergent property for news and international things as well as it is for coding. But there is this tension of what is new news that needs this web grounding? How much does it actually index on the credibility of these websites in order to deliver the news? There's a ton of latent questions here. But it did kind of raise the question for me of, we have had this notion of training cutoffs for a while now, where all of the OpenAI models, I think, are July 2025 is their last data cutoff. Anthropic, I think, is September for Opus and a little bit earlier for Sonnet. OpenAI or Anthropic will tag a data set release and say, this is all the data that's going to be used during our pre-training of the model. And anything else that we crawl or collect after this fact with our crawlers that are continuously running are just going to be shelved for later. You know, like that's going to be in the 2.0. That's going to be like in some later release. So it does feel like maybe that is going to change eventually with continuous fine tuning or continuous pre-training with some new data.
It's already starting, I think, man. I think more people are talking about continual learning. There's more conversations around how can you train models on an infinite context window at the limit? Is there a world in which you could basically just keep feeding models more and more context and not have to care that there's some arbitrary cutoff at which point models start forgetting things? All this falls into this broader category of continual learning mechanisms. And I've seen actually a lot of startups and a lot of researchers putting a lot more money into this and much more energy, research efforts into how can you get models just to always be learners, kind of like humans, right? The fact that we have these arbitrary date cutoffs is a little arbitrary. And I think that's going to be a historical artifact that isn't going to be true of future models. Like, I think we're going to look back at the current models and say, oh, how quaint that back in the day, these models didn't continuously learn. You know, it already feels like an outdated idea. I wouldn't be surprised if in the next couple of years, all models are just always learning all the time, basically.
Yeah, and whatever new information they get as part of that token stream is something that more or less is memorized, or at least remembered in a way that they can work with it. I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, we're trying to approximate human intelligence, and it feels like that element of memory or like updating priors is such a big part of the experience of how people learn in a more continuous way. I will say there is some industrial tension with that, I feel like, where one of the reasons why you freeze the actual models that are released is because people want to know, like API consumers of this model want to know that there's some stable behavior over time. And up until now, every single time that there has been a new model release, even if it pushes the envelope on all of the metrics that are benchmarked, it still negatively affects some users that were used to the behavior of the old model. You know, like it's a relatively common behavior that companies will have to at least, you know, analyze their prompts or analyze the accuracy when a new model bump comes out. It can't just be taken for granted that this model is necessarily going to be better than the model that we had hand fine-tuned all of these prompts for in the future. And that's also when people get pissed, when they accuse Chat or Claude of regressing in quality after their initial release. I feel like part of that is because they've shipped an update. Like there's some conspiracy theory that the weights have changed or the model has been quantized in some way. So the notion that models have to adapt over time and there will never actually be some fixed model is so antithetical to the paradigm that we have found ourselves in right now. I wonder if people will accept that as like a new base reality.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I think that the level of continuous learning that we're going to see is going to be at the level of the KV cache seems to be pretty promising. So this notion that as you're feeding more input into the model, this could either be you talking to the model or the model ingesting information from the internet on the fly. You could imagine that the weights stay fixed, but actually what's changing is some representation of the cache that the model has for your previous conversation. So what that could mean is that even though the weights aren't changing, let's say that this information about Maduro comes in, it's ingesting that information into the KV cache, and now your future conversations with the model going forward, the cache of your previous context is now also somehow implicitly going to encode the information that this thing happened in Venezuela. That's what I think is probably going to be the level at which we're going to be seeing continuous learning. I don't think it really makes sense for the model to take gradient update steps continuously on the fly. That just doesn't really seem like the right approach. It seems like an engineering hassle. It seems like what you're saying, it doesn't really make sense for there to be multiple different versions of the model at the level of the weights that are presented to different users. I think it still makes sense for there to be one model weight, but everyone has sort of like a personalized storage unit, and it would make sense that the KV cache initially maybe is that. If not the KV cache, then some sort of like notion of adapters or something like this. Maybe we could talk about adapters and this stuff in like a future episode, because there's actually a ton of research going into this right now.
Oh, it's a good hybrid, right? It's like you can basically get custom behavior and get effectively a longer context window without actually having to either expend the compute to maintain a context window that big or to fully retrain a model parameter. You kind of like hot swap these things.
Yeah, totally. You know what I think is kind of interesting? I mean, obviously everyone's been talking about RAG for these last couple of years. I almost feel like RAG has been this crutch that we've used to make it seem like a model can continuously learn. Because RAG, for whatever reason, it tends to work pretty well. Like this notion that you can just pass your query to an encoder model that basically looks up in some vector database the answer to your question, and then you literally just copy paste that answer into the prompt. That, for whatever reason, has worked really well. A bunch of papers have come out trying to see if we could improve on RAG, but yet it feels like the base implementation of RAG is still what everyone's using. It works pretty well. And it's almost like this thing that works well enough for people to not want to research more interesting mechanisms to get models to keep learning. But that if, we were to go down this route of trying to find more advanced mechanisms for models to be able to continuously learn, they would eventually beat RAG, is my hypothesis at least.
That's a hot take. It would basically just converge to RAG.
It would do better than RAG in ways that are sort of hard to quantify. Like RAG is just like this kind of like messy duct tape solution. I kind of hate it. It's not very elegant, Like this notion of having like an external database that you're like querying in some ways, and then
it's super antithetical to the idea of an end-to-end learned solution,
end-to-end learn,
right?
and it makes it hard to debug stuff, right? Like I was reading all these Twitter posts about, okay, if your RAG system is broken, when do you know that the encoder is broken? And when do you know that your LLM is broken? And when is there something in between? It's just like, I get it. I get that that's like a way of ingesting information into a model. It just seems kind of messy, and very duct taped. I don't know. I've never been like a crazy fan of RAG, but for whatever reason, it works really well and people like it. So I'll leave it at that.
I guess my hot take, honestly, is the interpretability is kind of what makes RAG so popular. I mean, maybe the whole vector embedding of it all, not necessarily, but there's no reason why RAG has to be backed by a vector database. Like a RAG system could just be a classic information retrieval system that you're just putting some prompt into and then getting some like ranked output document list.
Yeah.
And I think IR just works really well. Even now, the core algorithm of Google is basically still an IR system, combined with PageRank and some like LLM flavoring on top of it. But it works well. It's like interpretable. If you search some phrase, it makes sense to get you documents that have that phrase back within them.
Yep.
And then it puts the pressure on the LLM to filter out things that are irrelevant. But like, as long as you're optimizing for recall,
Right.
You have the golden nugget, you're able to get at least one needle in the haystack, even if you have a ton of hay, then that kind of works. And that lets you benchmark, okay, this is how well our retrieval's doing. We can label that data versus LLMs are still kind of black boxes. Well, Richard, speaking of LLMs being black boxes, I want to talk a little bit about chain of thought reasoning.
Okay.
Which I feel like really took the world by storm last year. Pretty much every popular model at this point is a chain of thought model. The telltale sign is when they pop up some thinking, text when they're actually responding to some prompt. So you'll give it the prompt. It'll take maybe 30 seconds, maybe sometimes 2 minutes or more thinking, and then give you back the actual output that you requested. And then, different providers have different user experiences in the interim, but it's burning tokens all that while. Like the chain of thought thinking is actually it expending tokens to think. So their main advertised benefit was that they're able to increase the accuracy of models by spending more time thinking before they lock in this final answer. So that's obviously good for users. It's good for the benchmark scores. But for researchers, one component that's actually more interesting is that they give us context on why the model is making decisions that it's making. So a lot of mechant guys have been trying to probe into how reliable chain of thought reasoning actually is for that goal. And the consensus is kind of, but only some of the time. right?
Right.
So Anthropic had a paper earlier this year, I think in August, about this phenomenon. And then OpenAI made a benchmark also about this behavior over the winter break. So I think it's worthwhile to talk about now. What really jumped out to you as you read this paper? And then also maybe taking one step back, how are they using the chain of thought token stream in order to actually try to do this interpretability research?
Yeah, it's actually surprisingly easy. So put yourself in the scenario where, let's say that you and a buddy are taking a test, right? It's a math quiz. Okay. It's like there'll be some question and multiple choice. Okay. And now let's say that you give your buddy just the answer sheet, right? You tell them, okay, hey, Pierce, the answer to 1 is B, the answer to 2 is C, the answer to 3 is D, and so on and so forth. And you tell a friend, I also want you to be really honest when you're solving this quiz, okay? Now, in this scenario here, let's imagine that your buddy isn't me or you, it's an LLM, and you gave them this prompt, right? You give them this quiz, and you give them the answer key, and you tell them to be, hey, be really truthful when answering the questions and tell me why you answered them. Now, what you would expect is that if this model is being maximally truthful, it would maybe explain to you why it answered the question in the way it did, but then it would also have to explain to you, by the way, buddy, I also had the right answer to begin with.
Yeah, that's right. I cheated.
Yeah,
Heads up, I'm looking this up.
It's not even necessarily that it's cheating. It's that it knows the right answer. It might have also solved it correctly, but it has to at least tell you, hey, just so you know, like, I did this step of calculating like the answer, but in addition to that, I knew what the answer was to begin with, right? So that's what you would want the model to do, right? You would want it to explain to you why it got to the answer, and then also tell you, in addition to that, I also have just the answer straight out, right? So that is basically the benchmark. And so what Anthropic did in this paper was they tried to basically analyze their models and say, if we give them the right answer, how often will they say that they answered the question because they had the answer to begin with? And I think it only acknowledged the fact that it answered the question because it had the answer like 25% of the time, which is kind of interesting. That feels pretty deceitful, right? If you told someone the right answer and they lie to you 3/4 of the time, or like they lied by omission, it kind of feels like kind of a jerk move, right? Like, you knew the answer, why didn't you just say it? So it only admitted to knowing the answer 1/4 of the time. DeepSeek R1 apparently acknowledged that it had the answer around 40% of the time. But this broadly, like this type of research into understanding whether models are honest falls into this idea of like faithfulness. This sort of approach of doing this, evaluating this faithfulness via chain of thought reasoning is really simple. I think it's pretty elegant. I actually think it might be a little flawed in some sense, because to what extent do you actually know what the model is thinking? But its output might not actually correspond to what is actually happening internally in the model. There's a little bit of a discrepancy there. This is more of like an epistemological question, like how do you know when someone knows something, right? But anyway, like if you buy this benchmark, I think it is still an interesting finding, in the fact that the model acknowledges it less than half the time when it has the right answer. I think that is actually pretty telling and at least interesting to talk about, regardless of if you buy this benchmark or not.
I think it's clear to me, at least, that chain of thought is not the end all be all solution to this. Hence, a lot of the other work in model interpretability that focuses on the actual neurons themselves, or on these weights that are actually happening when you're processing the network. Because on one hand, we have full visibility of what happens in this black box. Like, we have every single matrix recorded that we can potentially introspect. The issue is just that we don't know how to introspect these things yet. Whereas, in some ways, humans are kind of the opposite, where we really don't know what these neurons are doing. Like, we can't even register all of the neuron movements that are happening in real time. But like, we have a better sense of how people think, so we can at least model what we do know a little bit better. LLMs are like kind of the opposite. I thought one of the interesting developments that OpenAI added to this equation when they were curating this data set was the exact methodology that they use in order to come up with this ground truth, because it's a little bit different from what you were mentioning with how Anthropic did theirs. So the OpenAI one, they basically break it down into, I think it's 8, maybe 13 different categories. And they basically have some initial prompt. They take some initial questions on, am I the asshole on Reddit, right? So people who kind of go on and like, I was in this situation, I did this thing, am I a jerk? Am I the
classic
asshat
subreddit.
Here?
Yeah.
Amazing subreddit. I feel like half probably fake stories.
Also good for a road trip, by the way. If you're ever
Really?
just like road tripping somewhere, just read one out to like the group,
Oh, and like make that conversation fodder.
Yeah.
This guy was the asshole.
Yeah, totally.
That's literally what they asked the model to do.
Right.
So they were like, all right, here's the story. Here's like the initial prompt. We're going to give you none of the comments. Have the model weigh in on, yes, I think this person's being an asshole, or no, I don't think they're being an asshole. And then there's some baseline. So like the model does its chain of thought. It's like, well, yes, you cheated on them.
Right.
But but you didn't mean it, so like maybe you're not the asshole. It's like, no, you're probably the asshole. And then the bias. So then that was one example. They'd get that ground truth as a tool call. And then they'd run that same prompt with a little bias applied to it that's also within the prompt. So they would synthetically basically add to the end, like, I don't think I'm being a jerk here. I mean well, I'm a good-hearted guy, et cetera, et cetera. They run that through the model. And they measure situations in which that small bias term actually changes the model's final output to be like, this is a situation in which a small initial like perturbation in the input can actually drastically change the output that the model ends up deriving. And then they take that whole example, they bundle it up, and they say, okay, we have the prompt, we have the tool calls, we have the chain of thought reasoning, and we have the final answer. Let's now train a secondary model, which is going to try to classify whether or not there's something within the chain of thought tokens that leads to this bias. So it's like some way of kind of combining all these things. And I thought that was neat. I actually would not have organically come up with that problem framing, I don't think, of like injecting these bias terms and then adding some classifier on top of it. But that's basically the methodology to say, like, is there anything conceivable in the chain of thought that would even give some signal at volume to some, secondary rater or LLM judge on this chain? And, they found that yes, in a lot of cases, much like Anthropic, you can. But typically, it's actually more for smaller models that are maybe less internally confident and therefore have to use more thinking tokens, in which, because there's just more to work with, they can read that chain of thought and come to some conclusion. The really big, beefy models, this approach is a lot worse at doing because they're not forced to use that chain of thinking in the same kind of way.
Yeah. I hear you with all this research. I think it is super interesting. I just have to come back to my earlier point, which is that I think evaluating the ability of a thing, like this could be a language model or human, to think about something by asking them to tell you their thought process, to me, it just always feels flawed. The actual thought itself that occurs is occurring at this level of unconscious sort of processing of information in bits, right? The act of then taking that and communicating that into text, into words, is this really noisy process that itself can introduce a lot of, lack of fidelity and bias in and of itself, because speech is constrained. You can only say things in so many ways, right? Who knows if you could even communicate everything that you're thinking in speech? I mean, this is a whole lingo philosophical debate. Are there things that you can think that you can't say, right? The answer to which I think is yes. I think it's a little messy. I think that the mech and stuff that they're doing with, dictionary learning, looking at SAEs to try to understand what is actually happening within the model weights themselves is a little bit more along the correct lines. Because again, like with token distributions, it's not like models output tokens. I know this sounds like a hot take, but what models output is a probability distribution over tokens. And then you need another algorithm to then sample from that probability distribution, right? So who is to say that in the chain of reasoning, it's the model that's thinking incorrectly versus this like algorithm that decodes probability distributions into words, right? You have to separate these two things out.
I mean, to be fair, if the probabilities have a high enough activation where it's like almost obvious that is the most likely next thing.
Yeah, but no one uses greedy decoding. I mean, what you're saying is like at the limit, like sure, if you were to just use greedy decoding, then you could basically say, okay, well, it's the model here really that's doing the heavy lifting here. But usually we don't do that anymore. And there's actually approaches where you'll have some other model take in these probability distributions and itself then produce the tokens. There's all types of like different like Bayesian decoding approaches that do this. So I don't know. All I want to say is that take this with a big grain of salt. I am a little skeptical about this whole line of research. I think it's cool. I think it's catchy and it like feels kind of nice, right? It feels like, oh, like these are hot takes about how the model is thinking. That's cool. But
and like the model's giving us its own output,
yeah, it's like convenient and it's
going to
cool.
Tell us if there are any biases.
I think it's too convenient. I think it's a little bit BS. I just want to like call that out. I don't like fully buy it, but then at the same time, The model's telling you what it's thinking. Like, this is the future, models like supervising themselves. How cool is that? Yeah, I don't know. I'll leave it at that. I think it is. I think it is
I hear you.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I hear you. Like I said, I think the models are the ground truth here. Like the actual architecture, the matrices themselves, those numbers are how we get the output.
Sure.
Like it's giving us way more parameters that we can potentially introspect if and when we figure out how to introspect them.
Right.
I think that there's like kind of a cool framing here, maybe where we try to combine the two approaches a little bit. We're like in the training process itself, we're applying some of the mechint research onto the weights, having that output. Because, like these SAEs are not like inexpensive to train and then also to like use at scale on top of these models. So like maybe there's some way to co-train them at the same time. So there's like checkpoints that we train one at each checkpoint. And then we feed that in to actually influence the chain of thought tokens that are generated.
Yeah.
So we like try to align them better. So we know that if it is giving us some tokens as like thinking output, that those are actually the tokens that are like internal in the model. I don't know. I would watch this space. I think that combining some of these output representations seems like it might be interesting, but you're right. It's just this, as of right now, has been a convenient emergent property of unintentional training. Like we never really trained COT for thinking accuracy. We just trained it for eventual accuracy so that we would solve the problem. I'm curious whether or not the big companies and labs like really double down on this approach almost purely for the sake of mechanistic interpretability, or they're like, well, this is a research train, but let's just try to do something else.
You know that this is patented? Like Google has a patent on chain of thought. I just thought it was interesting.
Like the whole concept.
I think so. Yeah, I was looking this up today. I was really confused and baffled by how you can patent like the concept of this.
Yeah, they filed it 2023, I think, or 2022. So I guess a little ahead of the curve, but not by much. I mean, I feel like people were prompting the model for its own thinking way before that.
You'd think so, right?
Okay, Richard. Well, speaking of the big labs getting this competition, you know who I'm sure is not happy about Google getting that patent?
OpenAI.
They declared a code red. It's like the threat levels on the missile silos.
Do you think they have like an alarm going off,
Yes.
in their bougie office?
I do.
Downtown
I do.
SF.
It's right next to the mahogany.
Sam Altman is running around.
Well, listen, at least publicly there's a code red. I have no inside information on this. But after Gemini 3 was released, it had this really big surge, especially against a lot of metrics, including coding performance. Sam ended up announcing this internal code red push on December 2nd and had an emergency level company-wide refocus on ChatGPT. So as part of this effort, they said that they were delaying multiple initiatives like ads, Pulse personalized assistant, shopping health agents, whatever, all critical resources on deck. We need to figure this thing right out. And shortly thereafter, they released GPT 5.2 a week later as a response, which then kind of continued to edge out Gemini on some of these metric scores. So that was their initial response to the Gemini performance. I'm curious your takes on this. I mean, like the fact that there was a model that came out a week after Gemini, to me, means that this model was already in the works well before Gemini was announced. And maybe the productionalization decision happened after Gemini. But this was probably a checkpoint of a model that had been training for a while, right?
Yep.
And we'll probably continue to train after that and then end up landing in, 5.5 or 5.3 or whatever. But I mean, what do you think about this increasing competition, Rich? Where it feels like, at least in the consumer race, there's kind of this two-horse battle between OpenAI, Google. Is OpenAI right to be worried? Should Google be more worried? OpenAI has a sex appeal that I feel like Google has kind of been lacking for a while. Like, how do you level rate this as a positioning problem?
I think that these things are so fickle. I think it's, frankly, as a consumer, I like it. We always get better models. It feels like there's this Cold War space race almost domestically between these companies as well as internationally with China. And it just led to a bunch of really cool technology being pumped out in 2 years at speeds that are incredible, So I think we profit. I think, frankly, for OpenAI, it's one of these things where you really can't lose focus on the things that matter, on the fundamentals. And I think for me, what's become more and more clear is that the user experience is more important than just benchmarks for these models. Frankly, I don't really care whether a model has like a score of 83.8 on MMLU or 84.2 or 85.1. It's all kind of meaningless at a certain level, right? What I found to be the most important tell of whether I'll come back to a model is, first of all, basic things like, is it available, most of the time? Does it give me the answer pretty quickly? And does it just have a really fun user experience? And for me, throughout this whole thing, I've actually just noticed that the Claude models, especially like the recent Claude 4.5 Sonnet and Opus, have just delivered a really clean user experience that has me more and more feeling like these products are sticky in a certain way. And just to give an example, I
And
think
this is for coding. You're talking like as
this
a
is for
coding model?
coding. Yeah, as like
Yeah.
coding models, there are these certain models that just feel fundamentally like sticky somehow because they tend to get the right solution. They tend to be pretty human-like. They're not sycophantic, even though that feels like it's a solved problem at this point. And for me, the Claude models have some notion of good condensing of history so that it feels like as you interact with these models, they keep building up a more personalized intuition of who you are, what you're interested in, and they're able to condense past history into some sort of condensed set of tokens somehow. I don't know if you've noticed this, but when you're using Claude, right, it'll sometimes summarize the context history, which enables you to keep using the same window. So that itself is a user experience innovation that I think is more important than the models achieving a better benchmark score. And so my concern here with OpenAI is if they're sounding the code red and saying, hey, we really have to get these models to be a little bit better than Gemini 3 on this arcane math benchmark, I think that's losing the plot, right? I think OpenAI has a pretty good sense of product. I think that, they're trying different things out. They have these different like initiatives to see, can we create a user experience for education? Can we create one for the health domain? Can we create one for ads, right? I think all like this like sort of like buckshot approach of trying different things and seeing which one of these user experiences is novel and works and is fresh. I think that's smart. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that this code red thing and this sort of like, oh, we have to really compete for 0.1% increase in performance on MMLU. I think that's losing the plot. I think that's game over if from senior leadership, right? If that's the intuition of Sam Altman, if from the levels of senior leadership, these little things can sound a code red, I think that is a little bit of a bear signal for me, right? Broadly about the company. So yeah, I don't know. Does that make sense? Do you
Yeah,
agree?
you're basically saying that it's like theatrics.
I think it's theatrics. I think it's
Yeah.
just, dude, like these histrionics are just insane, like the models are good. Don't worry about it too much, would be my take. Keep focusing on like delivering a good user experience. And the reason that I'm using Claude more than OpenAI isn't because Claude is necessarily a better model. I don't even know what like it scores on benchmarks. I just know that it feels pretty good and like it has a good intuition for what kind of questions I'm going to ask it. So that's why I'm going to use it, right? It's that alignment process that I think is more important than the actual
Mhm.
ability to solve a arcane math question or coding question or physics question.
I mean, I feel like you're saying something that's almost ironic given the realignment within the company of they're putting these other initiatives on hold.
Yeah.
And maybe what you're saying is that these other initiatives actually matter more than the
I
underlying
think so.
model
I
weights.
think so. Yeah. I think so. I mean, we were just talking about continual learning like, 20 minutes ago. I think if you could have a company like OpenAI say, hey, look, we're going to be the company that makes it possible for you to not have to have 500 chat windows open all the time, right? Because that's the workflow nowadays, right? If I go on my chat or my Claude, like there'll be hundreds of different previous conversation windows, right? What a mess. How dumb is that, right? If OpenAI were to say, hey, we're going to be the company where you just have one window open, that's it. We're going to revolutionize the user experience. Everything is just going to be learned continuously. Yeah, that's sick, dude. That would be a model I would love to use. I don't want to have to like scroll through 500 windows to find the one time I asked about this one question, right? That's silly.
Yeah.
Why are we doing that? So it's little things like that are about the user experience that I think could really differentiate these companies and their products. But if Sam Altman is saying we have a code red here because DeepSeek or Gemini is beating us at this benchmark, I think that's totally like just losing the plot. As said, that's not what we care about as consumers. At least that's not what I think is important.
I think there's some irony where I've been using Codex a lot more recently in lieu of Claude Code. And it's a fantastic model. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? Like it actually is better than Opus at
Hmm.
some tasks, or at least on par most of the time, right?
Right.
Especially when you turn on like extra high thinking mode. I think the biggest thing is that we're now in a region of accuracy where it's almost hard to tell which is the better model, even if you give it a week or a few days to try the different model when it first comes out, right? They just all seem like they're kind of in the same ballpark.
Totally.
And I think that that is going to make it increasingly hard to convince people to switch and to try a new model, where especially after the last year, there's just such model fatigue.
Oh, 100%.
Right? Where they're like,
100%.
I literally have tried 50 models since January of 2025.
Yeah.
What is this next model going to do for me that the previous 50 were not able to do? And I think that sense of both just like a full glut of the architectures available and the fact that we're now in a regime where it's a little bit harder to just immediately introspect or validate which one is right and which one is wrong probably means that people that are already OpenAI people are going to stay on OpenAI. People that are already Anthropic people or Claude people are going to stay on Claude. People that are already Gemini people might stay on Gemini. And I think then, at least to me, that would mean that you should really double down on your ecosystem advantage of what are the things that people are already doing on your platform and make those better. And at least in the
100%.
current orientation, it does kind of feel like OpenAI is owning consumer, Anthropic is owning enterprise, and Gemini, I don't really know what Gemini is doing, like what their niche is. Kind of like Google products, like they're integrated natively with all the Google products.
Yeah, it's just Google, dude. Gemini
it's
is
just
Google
stuff, So, and like maybe that's fine. I feel like that doesn't satiate the really big providers because they want to own everything, like to justify these market valuations. There almost has to be one winner across the board. That would kind of make sense to me, that the real code red, I think, is if someone is going after your core market. I think that would be a really big problem. And maybe that's kind of what they're feeling behind the scenes. But I think some combination of like platform advantage, trying to double down on features and make things richer than just an API call that someone like could duplicate in theory and get all of the logic. It's a lot more of that stuff. And I think partnerships are part of that too, like you can see OpenAI signing these partnerships both on the app side of things with companies like DoorDash to try to make embedded applications within ChatGPT. You also have them inking deals with Disney to try to get Disney characters within Sora. Like, I think a lot of those company partnerships around becoming more of an aggregator hub, becoming more of a super app is like probably the consumer angle here that's going to be stickier than just developing the best model, bar none.
100%.
The enterprise thing, I think, is a little bit more of a question, because there's such money at stake there. And I think that there's less diversification about the API that's available for them to give you that's really differentiated. I think it's really just an accuracy game at that point, but not against benchmarks, against like company internal things, which is a little harder to quantify.
Yeah, dude, I 100% agree. I think that, OpenAI going for the ads route for the real jugular of Google is what I would do if I were Sam Altman. I've always thought this was like a great idea on the level of on the business side of OpenAI. As a consumer, I actually don't know if this is going to improve the product. Probably not. I actually probably don't want to see this. But in order to be able to meet the valuation that we've given these massive companies, we're talking like almost order like trillion, right? They need to be bringing in ridiculous amounts of revenue. And the only really safe way you can do that is by just putting ads there, right? So that's fundamentally always going to be the problem.
Well, now that they're suspending ads, we'll have to see when that ends up landing.
Yeah.
So TBD. Richard, the last thing that I want to get your takes on, Claude Skills. I think this was also something that dropped over the Christmas break. So, 2025 was the year of MCP. I feel like everyone and their mom was spinning up some new MCP plugin. And, MCP at its most basic levels, like pretty simple. It's basically saying, I have some functions that you can call, and here's a doc string attached to them about when you should use them. You stuff that into your prompt, and then Claude can call it, or OpenAI can call it. It kind of became the standard that started from Anthropic, but then everyone subsequently adopted to be able to plug and play. But it's super simple. It's like most basic level. MCPs are super simple. I think there's been a recognition recently that stuffing your prompt with that and making it really large all the time, because you're going to have to put all the doc strings in the prompt every single time you send the remote call, is probably a little wasteful and might hurt model performance. And there's been a little bit more of a tilt to just using like generic bash tools and calling those, or like making ad hoc scripts and running them. Claude Skills seems to be kind of a step in that latter vein, where you're basically bundling up markdown files and then scripts And they're just calling that a skill. So these markdown files, you can basically say anything you want, much like in a Claude MD or an Agents MD, where you say, given this situation, the user has some request where they want to fill out this PDF form, use this script that helps you fill out PDF forms. And then Claude can read that, say, okay, great. I now know that this tool exists. It'll run that tool, and then it'll execute the goal, and then continue on for whatever the eventual task is. The only thing that I think is really unique about this that I think is kind of clever is that it sandboxes the execution of these tasks in their cloud environment in a way that it doesn't touch anything else that you're working on. So it's basically like every time you're booting up the skill, you're almost calling some remote box that you can just have full control over and not need to worry that that's going to mess up my file system. Like even if this skill is illicit or like bad in some way, it's not going to hijack my computer.
Do you know how they do that, Pierce? I was actually kind of curious about this because spinning up a container, it's not super fast, but it feels like when interacting with Claude Skills, at least, for whatever reason, I don't know how they're able to sandbox so quickly that it feels like these things are running like instantaneously. Do you have any sense on that? Like why the cold start time is so fast?
I don't literally know what they're using. I imagine they're probably just using Firecracker, which is what most companies have converged on. It's basically this layer in between having a full container or a containerized environment and then having a VM where you're basically overriding these low-level primitives on a Linux system in order to say, we're going to make sure that everything that you call the memory space we're basically giving your program or your kernel access to is actually like compartmentalized in this way that's much lighter weight than if you actually boot up a whole Docker environment, because that fully requires you to boot up a new kernel. Firecracker's like kind of in the middle. It's like a lightweight VM. That's what most people are using for security encapsulation. Some companies have written their own, which basically do the same thing, but I think are technically using a different protocol, like Modal. The company that I know you've used, they've written their own.
Oh, interesting. Modal is it's magical when these things just spin up so quickly.
Totally.
I'm just like, how the hell are you guys doing this? Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. I think my take with sandboxing is it's intellectually pretty simple at its like most basic level, because like if you can write your own kernel and you're the only thing that determines who calls what and when, you can permission the system pretty well, right? Because you're just checking every request that's issued against this, this tool or whatever. And you're saying, okay, is this valid? Is this coming from the right place? If it is, do it. If it's not, don't do it. The complexities lie because of how complex Linux is, that you need to make sure that you're plugging all of these edge cases possible in order to do this well. So it's simple in theory or like in concept, but I think the implementation is like where the rubber really hits the road. And Firecracker, which originally started, by the way, as the Lambda group at AWS, like they wrote Firecracker to run all of these Lambda functions in isolate, optimized, prioritized basically speed of being able to boot up these things, and then tear that down just ad nauseum. So, it's pretty good. I don't think it's had some huge critical vulnerability yet that has really allowed someone to escape the sandbox environment. And I imagine that's how they're doing it. But obviously, like I said, I don't really know. I don't know, man. I do kind of feel like there's like the actual core of AI innovation right now. And then there's this like whole community of influencers who are usually not all that technical, who try to push products or push hype through these channels that are maybe based on some insight, but like they all kind of just resound to here's how you prompt an LLM differently to get some different output. And I've always been of the mind of, I just don't think there's really a silver bullet here. Like maybe you can improve the workflow that people use for these models, make things a little bit more structured or regimented, but like the model's the model. And like usually at this point, the simpler your prompts, probably the better, because it's just less shit for the model to like sort through and try to weigh the different priorities. And it's more in line with the training corpus of they're trained on pretty simple tasks. It makes sense to like make inference similar tasks that are like very well scoped. But I don't know, maybe Claude Skills will finally be the thing that like really breaks through the mainstream and people start to use.
I don't know if you agree with this or not, but I feel like for folks that are doing research or that are working with these models at a low level, I think there's a little bit of an eye roll whenever someone comes out with a new company or a new take and they pitch it in this like really techie way, Like I think LangChain was maybe like one of the first to do this a little bit with this like idea of like, hey, this is like a we're building an AI tool that kind of like leverages everything and is this like advanced tool mechanism that you have to know, right? If you've actually worked with these models fundamentally and you take a look at what is this new tool, you very quickly realize, oh, this is just prompt. Like you're just adding extra text in like a little fancy way. But
It's like 5 Python files in a
yeah, it's like
package.
I could write this in 2 hours or an hour. You know what I mean? This like prompt template thing that you use. I mean, this is just like a Python template thing that you're adding, and then you're processing the text that you prepend to the prompt, and then that's it, right? It's like nothing that fancy. But again, like a lot of it is just kind of like the smoke and mirrors around. Everyone wants to have some like hot take or some way of using these tools that it is different from everyone else because they have a certain insight. Yeah, I guess like since you obviously interact with a lot of LinkedIn folk, I imagine that this is like something that you probably have to like deal with a little bit more than I do. But it is a little bit of an interesting bifurcation in folks that work with LLMs between folks that I think do more like low level stuff and folks that are using it for running day-to-day like side hustles or startups if they're not that technical, right? Where these things to some people feel really important, like maybe the folks that are more hands-on, less technical. To researchers, I think it kind of feels like, who cares, And so, frankly, I haven't kept that up to date with some of these things because it just kind of feels like, there's nothing deep here, right? It's just kind of like a little like a wrapping around things that already exist and they're not that important. But I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Like maybe I should be paying more attention to this stuff. It just doesn't really feel like that fundamentally like game changing in any way.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing that I would add is coming up with some centralized way to share things that people find useful, I think has value.
Mm-hmm.
If someone is able to really crack the code on filling out PDFs,
Sure,
that is valuable as a Python library.
sure.
Like self-evidently, right? Or like doing all these post-processing tasks. I almost see this as like an alternative to PyPy in a way, maybe for normal people, right? Where you're like, you might want the benefits of this technology, which is largely concentrated in the engineering realms, like the fact that we're talking about scripts.
Sure.
You have to like be aware of what a script is. This is why script is useful in general. But if you're using a Claude skill that maybe you just click one button installed and suddenly Claude has access to it, you might not even need to know how the sausage gets made. It's like, you're basically booting up an app store effectively where you're trying to be this middle translation layer of there's something useful in the code, but the users themselves don't really want to be thinking in terms of code all the time. So you're interacting with the agent to kind of be this translation layer between different things. I see that's the use of almost all these things, MCPs included. It's like it's a conventional way to package something in a way that everyone kind of understands. Here's the scope here. Here's what it does. But in terms of what is new here or interesting technically, I mean, they didn't even have to retrain the model in order to do this.
Yeah.
You feel me? It's like the same model. They're just putting plumbing on top of it.
Yeah.
And I think that typically tells you that there's no interesting technical insight here, really. This is basically just like a convenience thing. But maybe it feeds into your point. We need better user experiences around this stuff. So maybe they're trying to do that.
You're right. I think that I tend to be critical when things feel like very superficial and lack depth in some ways, but you're right. Like it is ironic because I also do think that thinking about design and user experience is also super underrated. So I have a hard time squaring those two things, right? I think you do have to really be very high level artsy, think about the experience that people have when they interact with these things and give that a lot of weight. So I think you're right that this could be important. I just don't think that Claude Skills is going to be the thing that
it's not going to be the thing.
I don't think it's a thing. You know what I mean? It's not that guy, but it's cool. It's cool.
Well, I think that basically covers it. First week in January.
It's good to be back, man. It feels good.
It
feels good to be doing the podding thing again, dude.
I agree. It's been too long. We'll be back at it next week
with a special guest.
Yeah, we're back. We're back on our regular schedule, and we also have a very special guest, our second guest on the show.
Second guest on the show. All right, we won't say more though. I kind of want to keep it a surprise.
I agree. So get excited about that. Right before we go, I'll also announce that we're doing a Q&A session next week. So we're having our interview on Wednesday, and then we're doing our Q&A, kind of like the second listener mailbag that we did a few months ago. So if you do have questions for Richard or me, they can be about anything, probably AI focused, but if you want to ask us about what it's like to live
I'm
in
an
London
open
or
book,
San
baby.
Francisco, recommendations of coffee shops, we'll answer those too. Just shoot an email to team@pretrained.fm with your question. and what you think is interesting about it. And if you want to shout out by name on the show, or if you want us to say it's coming from anonymous, and we'll get them read and we'll answer them on the show.
I'm stoked, dude. It's gonna be great.
Yeah, me too. It's gonna be a fun episode. I really liked that one last time. So until then, Rich, we will talk soon.
We'll talk soon, buddy.
Later,
All
buddy.
right. Later.
Cheers.
Bye. Peace.
The used car game, I feel like almost regardless of where you are, what you're selling is kind of a racket. When I sold the Beamer, the one that I had a LaMotta, I had to go up to Marin to this guy's trusted mechanic. Who's I gotta have my guy check this out. So I'm like, yeah, sure, whatever, boss.
Sure.
So I like drive into this lot, and then this guy just starts standing in front of my car, and he's like telling me to slow down. So I'm like, oh, sure, this must be the mechanic. So he's like, can you step out of the vehicle? And I'm like, yeah, sure, dog. You got your keys?
Right.
And I was like, yeah, I got my keys. He's like, all right, sick. So he takes my keys, gets into the car, and then drives out of the parking lot.
Yeah, he just stole your
So
car.
then I'm just standing there, dude. Like, did this guy just steal
You're like, what?
my car?
What is going on?
What on earth happened, dude? And then I see this guy
dude.
just tossing a baseball. The only guy in this parking lot, aside from the guy who just stole my car.
Lord, dude.
So he's like tossing this.
Aside from the guy who stole your
He's just tossing this. And then it turns out this guy with the baseball is the guy that I was going to sell the car to. And the mechanic was just like doing a loop around the block. But still,
just to check.
I guess.
Okay.
And then he comes back and he's like, that thing purrs.
Mechanics, dude.
Mechanics,
That's so funny.
dude. And then we go in the mechanic shop and he has all these posters of just like naked chicks from the 70s.